The pen was literally inches from the paper when my 7-year-old granddaughter Lily burst through the front door of my Maplewood cottage, her backpack still bouncing on her shoulders from running all the way from the school bus stop. "Grandma Rosalind, don't sign that paper!" she screamed at the top of her lungs, her little face flushed red with panic and tears streaming down her cheeks. The real estate agent, a slick-talking man in an expensive suit named Derek Thornfield, nearly jumped out of his skin and knocked over his coffee mug all over my antique oak dining table. But something in Lily's voice, something desperate and terrified, made me freeze with that pen hovering over the signature line of what Derek had assured me was just a simple property transfer agreement to help with your financial troubles, Mrs. Whitmore. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if the story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. You see, I'd been struggling to keep up with the mounting medical bills after my husband, George, passed away 6 months earlier, and the property taxes on our family home in Willowbrook had skyrocketed to nearly $3,000 a month. Derek had shown up at my door 3 weeks ago with what seemed like a godsend, a company called Prestige Holdings that specialized in helping elderly homeowners unlock the equity in their properties while still being able to live there comfortably. He'd presented it as a reverse mortgage alternative, explaining how I could get a lump sum of $45,000 immediately to pay off my debts while still maintaining my right to live in the house for the rest of my life. "It's completely legal, Mrs. Whitmore," he'd said with that practiced smile. "You'll never have to worry about money again, and your granddaughter will still inherit the property when the time comes." But the moment Lily saw that document spread across my dining room table, something clicked in her young mind that my 73-year-old brain had somehow missed. She'd been staying with me every afternoon after school since her parents, my daughter Janet and her husband Kevin, both worked double shifts at Riverside General Hospital. Lily was unusually bright for her age, reading at a 5th grade level, solving math problems that stumped kids twice her age, and asking questions that often left adults speechless. But what I didn't know until that moment was that she'd been quietly listening to every phone conversation I'd had with Derek over the past 3 weeks, absorbing every detail of our discussions about the house, the money, and the contract terms. "Grandma, that man is trying to steal our house," she shouted, pointing a tiny, accusatory finger at Derek, who was now dabbing coffee stains from his tie and looking increasingly uncomfortable. "Now hold on there, sweetheart," Derek stammered, his voice losing that confident tone he'd maintained for weeks. But Lily wasn't having any of it. She marched right up to that dining room table, grabbed the contract with both hands, and started reading aloud in her clear, determined voice. Section 12, subsection C. In the event that the resident fails to maintain the property according to company standards, or if the resident is deemed unable to safely occupy the premises, Prestige Holdings reserves the right to terminate the residency agreement with 30 days written notice. My heart sank into my stomach as I realized what my brilliant little granddaughter had just exposed. This wasn't a reverse mortgage or a helpful financial arrangement. It was a predatory scheme designed to legally steal my home from under me. Derek had been counting on my grief, my financial desperation, and my trust in his polished presentation to blind me to the fine print that would have left me homeless and penniless. The property standards clause was so vague that they could have kicked me out for anything. A leaky faucet, a loose floorboard, even failing to keep the garden weeded to their satisfaction. And the safety determination would be made entirely by their own company assessors with no independent oversight or appeal process.
"You need to leave right now," I said to Derek, my voice shaking with a mixture of rage and humiliation at how close I'd come to falling for his con. "And take your fraudulent paperwork with you." Derek tried to salvage the situation, insisting that Lily had misunderstood, that the contract was completely legitimate, that I was making a huge mistake by not signing. But Lily stood there beside me like a tiny bodyguard, her arms crossed and her jaw set, with the kind of determination that reminded me so much of her late grandfather George when he'd made up his mind about something. As Derek gathered his papers and slithered out of my house like the snake he was, I looked down at my granddaughter and realized that this 7-year-old child had just saved me from losing everything I had left in this world. The family home where I'd raised my children, where George and I had shared 47 years of marriage, where Lily herself had taken her first steps and spoken her first words. It had all been seconds away from being stolen by a man in an expensive suit who made his living preying on vulnerable seniors. But what I didn't know yet, what I wouldn't discover until I started digging deeper into Derek Thornfield and Prestige Holdings, was that this was just the tip of the iceberg. My little granddaughter hadn't just saved our house. She'd unknowingly helped me uncover a massive fraud operation that had been targeting elderly homeowners across 3 counties. And by the time I was finished with Derek and his criminal enterprise, Lily's moment of courage would end up protecting hundreds of other families from losing their homes to the same predatory scheme. My name is Rosalind Whitmore, and I'm 73 years old. I've lived in the same house in Willowbrook for 47 years, raised 3 children within these walls, and buried the love of my life just 6 months ago. But from wherever you're watching this, I need you to stay with me, because what I'm about to tell you will change how you think about trusting strangers who show up at your door with promises to solve your problems. Have you ever been so desperate, so overwhelmed by circumstances beyond your control, that you almost made a decision that would have destroyed everything you hold dear? Have you ever been grateful that someone, anyone, seemed to care enough to offer help, even when deep down something felt wrong, but you ignored that feeling because you needed hope more than you needed caution? That's exactly where I was 3 weeks before my granddaughter Lily saved our family home. I was drowning in medical bills, property taxes, and the crushing weight of widowhood, and I was ready to trust a complete stranger simply because he wore a nice suit and spoke with confidence about solutions I desperately wanted to believe existed. You see, grief does something to your judgment that I never understood until I lived through it myself. When George passed away from pancreatic cancer after a brutal 8-month battle, I didn't just lose my husband. I lost my decision-making partner, my voice of reason, and the person who'd always been able to spot a scam from a mile away. George had handled all our finances for nearly 5 decades. He'd been the one who read every contract twice, who questioned every salesperson, who protected our family from the countless people over the years who'd tried to take advantage of us. Without him, I felt like I was navigating a foreign country without a map or translator. The medical bills alone were staggering. Even with Medicare, we still owed over $38,000 to Riverside General, the Oncology Center, and various specialists who tried to save George's life. The property taxes on our 3-bedroom colonial had jumped from $1,200 a year to nearly $3,000 because our neighborhood had been reassessed as up-and-coming real estate. And then there were the everyday expenses of living alone, utilities, groceries, maintenance, that somehow felt twice as expensive when you're living on a fixed income and facing them without your life partner. I'd always been proud of our financial independence. George and I had worked hard our entire lives, him as a mechanic at Fortin Auto Repair, and me as a secretary at Willowbrook Elementary School. And we'd managed to pay off our mortgage 15 years ago. We thought we had done everything right. Saved responsibly, made smart choices. But nothing prepares you for the financial devastation that comes with extended illness and death in America, even when you think you have good insurance.
So when Derek Thornfield showed up at my door that rainy Tuesday afternoon in October, dressed in his charcoal gray suit and carrying a leather briefcase, speaking knowledgeably about equity release programs and senior financial assistance, I wanted to believe him more than I'd wanted to believe anything in months. He had answers to problems that had been keeping me awake at night. He had solutions that seemed almost too good to be true, which should have been my first warning sign. But here's what I need you to understand about people like Derek Thornfield. They don't target random houses. They don't knock on doors hoping to get lucky. They research their victims carefully, looking for widows and widowers who've recently lost spouses, people facing medical debt, seniors who live alone in valuable properties. Derek knew my husband had died. He knew about my financial struggles. He'd probably been watching my house for weeks, noting when I got my mail, when I left for grocery shopping, when I seemed most isolated and vulnerable. My daughter Janet had been wonderful through George's illness and death, but she and her husband Kevin were both working 60-hour weeks at the hospital just to keep their own family afloat. They had their own mortgage, their own children to worry about, and while they would have helped if they could,
I didn't want to burden them with my problems. That's something else predators like Derek count on, the pride and independence of their victims, the reluctance to ask family for help, the shame of admitting you can't handle things on your own. So I became the perfect target, a grieving widow with a valuable property, mounting debts, and no one looking over my shoulder to question the stranger who promised to solve all my problems with one simple signature. Derek had spotted my vulnerability from a distance and moved in like a shark following the scent of blood in the water. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't have imagined, was that my 7-year-old granddaughter had been quietly watching and listening to every interaction Derek and I had over those 3 weeks. While I was focused on his promises and solutions, Lily was noticing things I missed, inconsistencies in his stories, phone conversations he thought no one was overhearing, and the way his whole demeanor changed when he thought no adults were paying attention. Children see the world differently than adults do. They haven't yet learned to ignore their instincts in favor of social politeness or desperate hope. They haven't been taught that questioning authority figures is rude, or that doubting someone's motives makes you cynical. Lily looked at Derek Thornfield and saw exactly what he was, a predator, while I looked at him and saw what I needed him to be, a rescuer. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how my granddaughter saved our home and exposed a criminal enterprise that was targeting seniors across 3 counties, you first need to understand exactly how close I came to losing everything and how a 73-year-old widow became the woman who brought down one of the most sophisticated financial fraud operations our state had ever seen. After Derek slithered out of my house that afternoon, I stood in my living room for what felt like an eternity, staring at the coffee stains on my antique oak table and trying to process what had just happened. My hands were shaking so violently I had to sit down in George's old recliner, the brown leather chair that still smelled faintly of his aftershave and pipe tobacco. Lily had saved me from making the biggest mistake of my life, but the reality of how close I'd come to signing away our family home hit me like a freight train. The immediate shock gave way to a crushing wave of humiliation that made my chest feel tight and my breathing shallow. How could I have been so naive? How could a woman who'd lived 73 years on this earth, who'd raised 3 children and managed a household for decades, have been so easily fooled by a man in an expensive suit with a smooth voice and rehearsed answers? George would have seen through Derek's scheme in 5 minutes. George would have asked the right questions, demanded to see credentials, insisted on having our family lawyer review any documents before I even considered signing them. But George wasn't here anymore, and I'd been flying blind for 6 months, making decisions I'd never had to make alone, navigating a world of financial complexity that had always been his domain. The weight of that responsibility felt heavier in that moment than it ever had before. I wasn't just mourning my husband anymore. I was mourning my own confidence, my ability to trust my instincts, my sense of competence in managing my own life.
Lily had disappeared upstairs to her room, probably sensing that I needed some time to absorb what had just transpired. But after about 20 minutes, she came padding back down the stairs in her stocking feet, carrying her favorite stuffed elephant, a worn purple creature named Mr. Peanuts that she'd had since she was 3 years old. She only brought Mr. Peanuts when she was feeling particularly serious or worried about something. "Grandma Rosalind," she said softly, climbing up into the recliner with me, even though it was really only big enough for one person. "Are you okay? You look really sad." Her small hand found mine, and I realized I'd been crying without even knowing it. Tears were streaming down my cheeks and dripping onto my blue cardigan sweater. "I'm okay, sweetheart," I managed to say, though my voice came out all wobbly and uncertain. I'm very grateful that you were here today. You saved us from something very bad, and I don't know how to thank you for that." She snuggled closer to me, and I could feel the steady rhythm of her breathing against my arm. "Grandma," she said after a few minutes of comfortable silence, "I think that man has done this to other people, too. When he was talking on his phone yesterday, he said something about the Henderson property and the Martinez situation. He said those people never knew what hit them and that the formula works every time. I think he's been stealing houses from other grandmas and grandpas. The words sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the October weather outside. If Lily was right, and given how accurate her eavesdropping had proven to be about my own situation, then Derek and his company weren't just individual criminals. They were running a systematic operation targeting vulnerable seniors across our community and possibly beyond. The thought of other families losing their homes to the same predatory scheme that had almost claimed ours made me feel sick to my stomach. But after the horror came something else, a spark of anger that started small and grew stronger with each passing moment. Derek Thornfield and Prestige Holdings had picked the wrong widow to mess with. They had assumed I was just another isolated, confused old woman who would quietly disappear after they stole my home. They had no idea that I'd raised 3 strong-willed children, that I'd spent 30 years dealing with difficult parents and administrators at Willowbrook Elementary, that underneath my polite exterior was a spine of pure steel that George had always admired and occasionally warned people not to underestimate. "Lily," I said, sitting up straighter in the chair and wiping away my tears with the back of my hand, "I think you might be absolutely right about that, and I think we need to do something about it." Her eyes lit up with the kind of excitement that only children get when they realize adults are finally taking their ideas seriously. "What can we do? Should we call the police? Should we tell Mommy and Daddy?" Those were logical suggestions, but something told me that reporting Derek to the local authorities might not be enough. Men like him were usually careful to stay just on the right side of legal technicalities, using legitimate-looking contracts and official business entities to hide their predatory practices. I looked around our living room, at the family photos covering the mantel, at the built-in bookshelves George had installed himself 40 years ago, and the hardwood floors we'd refinished together when the kids were young, and I felt a fierce protectiveness rise up in my chest. This wasn't just my home. This was the repository of our family's entire history, the place where my children had grown up and where my grandchildren were making memories of their own. Derek had tried to steal all of that with his lies and manipulation, and I was starting to suspect that other families in our community had already lost similar treasures to his schemes. "First," I said to Lily, "we're going to write down everything you remember about those phone conversations you overheard. Every name, every detail, every word you can recall. Then we're going to do some research on Mr. Derek Thornfield and his company to see exactly what kind of operation they're running." Lily nodded solemnly, understanding that we were embarking on something important and serious. "And then?" she asked, her 7-year-old mind already racing ahead to the next steps. I smiled at her for the first time since Derek had darkened our doorway 3 weeks earlier, feeling more clear-headed and determined than I had in months. "Then, sweetheart, we're going to make sure that Derek Thornfield never gets the chance to steal another family's home ever again." I had no idea yet how we were going to accomplish that goal, but I knew with absolute certainty that we were going to try. Derek had made a crucial mistake when he targeted our family. He underestimated both the intelligence of a 7-year-old girl and the determination of a widow who had nothing left to lose and everything left to protect.
What I didn't know yet was that this decision would transform me from a victim into an investigator, from a target into a protector, and from a confused widow into the woman who would bring down one of the most sophisticated financial fraud operations our state had ever encountered. To understand how Derek Thornfield had been able to manipulate me so effectively, you need to know about the pattern of vulnerability that had been building in my life for months before he ever knocked on my door. This didn't start with his smooth sales pitch or his expensive suit. It started the day George was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, 14 months before Derek appeared in my living room. George had always been our family's shield against the outside world. He was the one who dealt with pushy salespeople, who read the fine print on contracts, who asked the hard questions that made people uncomfortable. When telemarketers called during dinner, George would politely but firmly tell them we weren't interested and hang up. When door-to-door solicitors appeared with charity drives or home improvement offers, George would listen politely for exactly 30 seconds before saying, "Thank you, but we're not interested," and closing the door. He had an instinct for spotting people who weren't quite what they seemed, and he'd protected our family from countless scams and schemes over the years without me even realizing it. But when George got sick, really sick, everything changed. Suddenly, we were dealing with a medical system that seemed designed to confuse and overwhelm patients and their families. Insurance companies sent us forms that might as well have been written in a foreign language. Medical billing departments called with questions about coverage and copays that George was too weak to handle and I was too inexperienced to understand. We had to make decisions about experimental treatments, second opinions, and specialist consultations that cost thousands of dollars we didn't have, all while watching the man I'd loved for 47 years waste away before my eyes. During those 8 months of George's illness, I learned to say yes to things I should have questioned. Yes to the medical transport service that charged $300 to drive George 12 miles to chemotherapy appointments. Yes to the patient advocate who promised to help us navigate insurance claims for a fee of $50 per phone call. Yes to the supplemental insurance policy that a smooth-talking agent sold us over the phone, promising it would cover all the expenses Medicare wouldn't touch, a policy that turned out to exclude cancer treatment entirely due to a pre-existing condition clause buried on page 47 of the contract. Each time I got taken advantage of during George's illness, I told myself it was just the cost of desperation, the price of loving someone enough to try anything that might help them. But what I didn't realize was that each small surrender was training me to be a better victim, teaching me to trust people who spoke with authority about subjects I didn't understand, conditioning me to be grateful for anyone who offered solutions to problems that felt too big for me to handle alone. The pattern got worse after George died. Suddenly, I was dealing with funeral directors who insisted I needed the most expensive casket to properly honor my husband's memory, estate lawyers who charged me $1,500 for paperwork I probably could have filed myself, investment advisors who called weekly with opportunities to help me maximize George's life insurance payout. Each person who took advantage of my grief and confusion made it easier for the next person to do the same. By the time Derek Thornfield appeared at my door, I had been conditioned to see myself as someone who needed help, someone who couldn't be trusted to make important decisions alone, someone who should be grateful when knowledgeable professionals offered to solve my problems. I'd spent over a year being told by various experts that my instincts were wrong, that my concerns were unfounded, that I should trust their expertise over my own judgment. Derek understood this psychology perfectly. During our first meeting, he spent 20 minutes asking about George, expressing sympathy for my loss, commenting on how difficult it must be to handle everything alone. He positioned himself not as a salesman, but as a concerned professional who understood my situation because he'd helped many other widows in similar circumstances. He made me feel like seeking his help was a sign of wisdom, not weakness. "Mrs. Whitmore," he'd said during that first visit, settling into George's chair like he belonged there, "I can see you're the kind of woman who's always been self-reliant, who's taken care of her family and managed her household with skill and dedication. But even the strongest people need support during difficult transitions, and there's no shame in accepting help when it's offered by people who genuinely want to see you succeed."
Those words had exactly the right note of respect and concern. Derek wasn't treating me like a confused old woman who couldn't handle her own affairs. He was treating me like a competent person who was dealing with temporary challenges that any reasonable person would need assistance managing. It was masterful manipulation, and I fell for it completely.
Over the 3 weeks of our interactions, Derek established a routine that made me feel like he genuinely cared about my well-being. He'd call every few days to check on me, asking about my health, my family, whether I was sleeping well or eating properly. He'd bring me coffee and pastries from the expensive bakery downtown, insisting that everyone deserves a little sweetness during difficult times. He'd arrive for our meetings exactly on time, dressed professionally but not intimidatingly, carrying folders full of official-looking documents that seemed to support everything he was telling me. Most importantly, Derek never pushed. He presented the Prestige Holdings program as something I should only consider if it felt right to me, something I should take my time thinking about, something he'd be happy to explain again if I had any questions. This patient approach made me feel like I was in control of the decision, like I was choosing to trust him rather than being pressured into anything. But underneath all that careful relationship building, Derek was systematically isolating me from people who might have protected me. He scheduled our meetings for weekday afternoons when Janet and Kevin were at work. He suggested that family members might not understand the complexities of equity release programs, that they might worry unnecessarily about decisions that were ultimately mine to make. He praised my independence and decision-making abilities while subtly undermining my confidence in anyone else's judgment. The wonderful thing about working with mature adults like yourself, he'd said just the week before, is that you don't need permission from your children to make smart financial decisions. You've been managing money longer than they've been alive, and you understand your own needs better than anyone else possibly could. By the time he spread that contract across my dining room table, Derek had spent 3 weeks convincing me that signing it would be an act of wisdom and self-determination, not surrender and victimization. He'd made me feel like I was finally taking control of my financial situation, rather than letting it control me. He'd positioned himself as the ally who respected my intelligence enough to offer me a sophisticated solution that other people might not understand or appreciate. It was a perfect psychological trap built over weeks of careful manipulation and designed to exploit every vulnerability that grief and isolation had created in my life. And if it hadn't been for a 7-year-old girl who saw through his performance with the clarity that only children possess, I would have walked into that trap with my eyes wide open, grateful for the opportunity to destroy everything George and I had built together. The sacrifices I had made for my family over the years weren't just financial. They were pieces of my identity, my dreams, and my future that I had willingly given away because that's what mothers and wives did in my generation. But it wasn't until Derek Thornfield tried to steal my home that I truly understood how much I had invested in the people I loved, and how little recognition those investments had received over the decades. When George and I first bought our house on Elmwood Drive in 1976, it cost us $18,000, money we scraped together by working double shifts, selling my grandmother's jewelry, and borrowing $3,000 from George's brother with the promise to pay it back within 2 years. I was 26 years old then, pregnant with our second child, and working as a part-time secretary at Willowbrook Elementary while George put in 60-hour weeks at Thornton Auto Repair. We were young and hopeful and absolutely convinced that hard work and sacrifice would eventually pay off in security and comfort for our family. What followed were decades of choosing my family's needs over my own wants, their dreams over my ambitions, their comfort over my personal fulfillment. When Janet needed money for college, I took a second job cleaning offices at night so we wouldn't have to touch the small savings account George and I had managed to build. When our son Michael wanted to pursue his music degree at the expensive conservatory 3 states away, I sold the car George had restored for me and took the bus to work for 2 years so we could afford his tuition. When our youngest, David, needed surgery for a deviated septum that insurance wouldn't cover, I canceled the vacation George and I had been planning for 5 years and used that money to pay the medical bills. Every sacrifice felt meaningful at the time because I could see the immediate benefit to someone I loved. Janet graduated debt-free and became a nurse. Michael got his music degree and now teaches violin to children in Seattle. David's surgery allowed him to breathe properly and pursue athletics in high school, which earned him a scholarship to State University. Each time I gave up something I wanted for something they needed, I felt like I was investing in their futures, building a legacy of love and support that would somehow come back to strengthen our family bonds. But what I didn't anticipate was how invisible those sacrifices would become once they had served their purpose. Janet remembered that college was expensive, but she didn't remember the months I came home from my night cleaning job with my back aching and my hands raw from industrial chemicals. Michael remembered getting his degree, but he didn't remember that I sold my car, the first car I'd ever picked out myself, to help pay for it. David remembered his surgery working, but he didn't remember that George and I never did take that vacation we'd been planning, and in fact, never took another real vacation for the rest of our marriage. The pattern continued even after my children were grown and had families of their own. When Janet and Kevin bought their first house, George and I co-signed their mortgage because their credit wasn't quite good enough to qualify for the loan they needed. When Michael's music students couldn't afford lessons during the recession, I sent him money every month for 3 years to help keep his studio afloat. When David's business was struggling, George and I refinanced our own home to lend him $15,000 that we never expected to see again, and never did. Each time my children were grateful in the moment, they'd call to thank us, send cards expressing their appreciation, promise they'd never forget what we'd done for them. But gratitude has a short shelf life, especially when the people receiving it are busy with their own lives, their own challenges, their own financial pressures. Within months of each sacrifice, it became just part of the family history, something we'd done because we could afford to do it, because we were their parents and that's what parents do. What hurt the most wasn't the lack of acknowledgement. It was the assumption that our financial help came effortlessly, that George and I had so much money that sharing it caused us no hardship. None of my children ever asked what we had given up to help them. None of them ever wondered whether their needs might be conflicting with our own plans and dreams. They saw us as the bank of mom and dad, always available for loans and gifts, never struggling with our own financial limitations or personal desires. This became painfully clear during George's illness, when the medical bills started mounting and our savings began disappearing at an alarming rate. I called Janet first, not to ask for money, but just to talk through our options, to get some emotional support from my daughter who worked in healthcare and might understand what we were facing. Her response was kind but dismissive. "Oh, Mom, you and Dad have always been so good with money. I'm sure you'll figure something out. You always do." When I mentioned to Michael that we were struggling with the cost of George's experimental treatments, he said, "Well, you own your house outright, right? Maybe you could get a home equity loan or something." It was a reasonable suggestion, but it revealed how little he understood about our actual financial situation. Yes, we owned our house, but it was our only real asset. Taking out loans against it would mean risking the one thing we had to leave our children and grandchildren. David's response was the most telling. When I explained that George's illness was draining our savings faster than we'd anticipated, he said, "But Dad's got good insurance through the union, doesn't he? And you've been saving for retirement your whole lives. Surely you're not in any real trouble." The assumptions in that statement, that insurance actually covered everything, that we'd been able to save substantial amounts on a mechanic's and secretary's salaries, that we had hidden resources to draw from, showed me how completely my children had misunderstood our financial reality. The truth was that every dollar George and I had ever saved beyond our basic living expenses had been given away to help our children pursue their dreams and solve their problems. We'd chosen their immediate needs over our long-term security so many times that by the time George got sick, we had almost nothing to fall back on. Our retirement savings consisted of George's small pension from the auto shop and my even smaller pension from the school district. Our emergency fund had been depleted years earlier during David's business crisis. Our only real asset was our house, and now Derek Thornfield was trying to steal that too.
Sitting in George's recliner after Derek left that day, I realized that my decades of sacrifices had left me not just financially vulnerable, but emotionally isolated. My children loved me, but they didn't really understand my situation because I'd been so successful at protecting them from it. They saw me as the strong, capable mother who always had solutions, never as the widow who was drowning in medical debt and property taxes because she'd spent her entire adult life prioritizing their needs over her own financial security. But Lily saw something different. In her 7-year-old mind, I wasn't the bottomless well of resources that my adult children imagined. I was Grandma Rosalind, who made her peanut butter sandwiches and helped her with homework and needed protecting from bad men who wanted to steal our house. She understood instinctively what my own children had forgotten, that love means protecting the people who have spent their lives protecting you. Derek Thornfield had counted on my isolation, my pride, and my reluctance to burden my children with my problems. He'd assumed I was just another forgotten widow with no one looking out for her interests. But he'd made a critical miscalculation. I wasn't alone. I had a 7-year-old guardian angel who saw through his lies and loved me enough to fight for our family home. That night, after Lily had gone to bed clutching Mr. Peanuts and whispering promises that she'd help me catch the bad house stealer, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea and tried to piece together everything that had happened. The adrenaline from Derek's hasty departure was wearing off, leaving me with this strange mixture of relief and dread. I'd avoided disaster by mere minutes, but the questions swirling in my mind wouldn't let me rest. How had Derek known so much about my financial situation? How had he known George had died, that I was struggling with medical bills, that I lived alone most of the time? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that his appearance at my door hadn't been random at all. Someone like Derek didn't just knock on doors hoping to find vulnerable widows. He researched his targets carefully, and that meant there was information about me floating around somewhere that predators could access. I pulled out the manila folder where I kept all my important papers, the same folder where Derek's contract would have ended up if Lily hadn't burst through that door. As I spread the documents across my kitchen table, I began to see patterns I'd never noticed before. Insurance forms with my personal information, medical billing statements that listed George's deceased, property tax assessments that showed I was the sole owner of a valuable home, credit reports that revealed my debt-to-income ratio. All of this information was supposedly private, but apparently it was available to people who knew how to look for it. But it was when I opened my laptop, the same computer George had taught me to use for email and online banking, that I made the discovery that changed everything. I'd been getting emails for months from something called Senior Financial Solutions Network, messages I'd always deleted without reading because I assumed they were spam. But that night, curiosity made me check my deleted items folder. And what I found there made my blood run cold. The emails weren't random spam at all. They were personalized messages that contained eerily accurate information about my situation. Mrs. Whitmore, we understand you're facing challenges after your husband's recent passing. As a homeowner in the 28562 zip code dealing with medical debt, you may qualify for our Equity Assistance Program. Widows like you shouldn't have to face financial stress alone when solutions are available. Each email contained details that only someone with access to my personal records could have known. They knew George's death date within a few weeks. They knew our approximate medical debt. They knew the assessed value of our home. They even knew that I'd been making minimum payments on credit cards, a detail that should have been completely private. As I scrolled through dozens of these emails dating back to just 2 weeks after George's funeral,
I realized I was looking at evidence of a sophisticated data mining operation. Someone was collecting information about vulnerable seniors and selling it to predators like Derek Thornfield. The Senior Financial Solutions Network wasn't offering solutions at all. They were creating a database of potential victims. But the real revelation came when I decided to search my email for any correspondence with Derek or Prestige Holdings. What I found was an email I'd completely forgotten about, sent 3 days before Derek's first visit. It was disguised as a property assessment notification from something called Regional Housing Analytics, informing me that my home had been selected for a complimentary equity evaluation that could help me understand your options during this difficult transition period.
I'd assumed it was another piece of junk mail and hadn't even opened it properly. But reading it now with clear eyes, I could see it was actually a sophisticated phishing operation. The email contained a link that claimed to lead to a quick questionnaire about my housing situation, but I realized now that clicking on it would have given them access to even more personal information from my computer. Fortunately, my lack of technical sophistication had actually protected me. I'd never clicked on the link because I didn't understand what it was asking me to do. This was when the scope of what I was dealing with truly hit me. Derek Thornfield wasn't just a lone con man who'd gotten lucky finding a vulnerable widow. He was part of an organized network that was systematically identifying, researching, and targeting seniors across our entire region. They had access to databases that should have been private. They had sophisticated email systems that could personalize their outreach. They had legal documents that looked legitimate enough to fool people far more educated than I was. I thought about Lily's words from earlier that day. I think that man has done this to other people too. She'd overheard Derek mentioning the Henderson property and the Martinez situation, talking about people who never knew what hit them. If this operation was as sophisticated as it appeared to be, then there were probably dozens, maybe hundreds of families who hadn't been as fortunate as we were. Families who didn't have 7-year-old guardians to save them from signing away their homes. The weight of that realization was almost overwhelming. I sat there in my kitchen at nearly midnight staring at my computer screen and understanding that I'd stumbled onto something much bigger than one man trying to steal one house. This was a criminal enterprise that was preying on the most vulnerable members of our society, using their grief and desperation against them in ways that were probably technically legal, but morally monstrous. But alongside the horror came something unexpected, a sense of purpose that I hadn't felt since George's death. For months, I'd been drifting through my days feeling useless and forgotten, like a leftover person whose main purpose in life had ended when her husband died. The world seemed designed for couples and families, not for solitary widows trying to figure out how to fill their empty hours and find meaning in their remaining years. Now, suddenly, I had a mission that felt important and urgent. I had stumbled onto information that could protect other families from losing their homes to predators like Derek. I had evidence of a criminal operation that law enforcement needed to know about. I had a chance to turn my near disaster into something that could help countless other seniors avoid the same trap. The irony wasn't lost on me. Derek Thornfield had chosen me as a victim because he thought I was isolated, confused, and powerless. He'd assumed that a 73-year-old widow living alone would be easy prey, someone who would quietly disappear after he stole her home and no one would ask uncomfortable questions about what had happened to her. But Derek had made a critical miscalculation. He'd underestimated not just Lily's intelligence and protective instincts, but my own capacity for righteous anger when someone threatened my family. He thought he was targeting a helpless old woman, but what he'd actually done was awaken a grandmother who had spent decades protecting the people she loved and who wasn't about to stop now. Looking at that evidence spread across my kitchen table, the personalized phishing emails, the sophisticated targeting system, the mentions of other victims, I realized that Derek's attempt to steal my home had actually given me something invaluable. It had given me the information and motivation I needed to fight back not just for myself, but for every other senior who was being targeted by this criminal network. For the first time since George died,
I felt like I had a reason to get up in the morning that went beyond just surviving another day. I had work to do, and that work was going to ensure that Derek Thornfield and his associates never got the chance to destroy another family the way they'd almost destroyed mine. The next morning, I woke up before dawn with a clarity of purpose I hadn't felt in months. While Lily was still sleeping upstairs, I made myself a strong cup of coffee and spread everything I'd discovered the night before across my dining room table, the same table where Derek had almost convinced me to sign away our home. But now, instead of feeling like a victim staring at my own potential destruction, I felt like a detective assembling evidence for a case that could protect countless other families.
My first call was to someone I should have contacted weeks ago, my old friend Margaret Henley, who'd worked as a paralegal at Morrison & Associates law firm for 35 years before retiring. Margaret and I had maintained our friendship through book club meetings and occasional lunches, but I'd been too embarrassed about my financial struggles to confide in her during George's illness and after his death. Now, as I dialed her number at 7:30 in the morning, I realized that my pride had almost cost me everything. "Rosalind," Margaret answered on the second ring, her voice sharp with concern. "Is everything all right? You never call this early." I could hear the sound of her coffee maker gurgling in the background, and I pictured her in her neat kitchen, already dressed and probably reading the morning paper. "Margaret, I need your legal expertise," I said without preamble. "I almost got scammed yesterday, and I think I've uncovered something that could be affecting seniors all across our county." I spent the next 20 minutes walking her through everything that had happened with Derek, everything Lily had overheard, and everything I had discovered in my email investigation the night before. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that I thought we might have been disconnected. Finally, Margaret spoke, and her voice carried a mixture of admiration and concern that I hadn't expected. "Rosalind, what you're describing sounds like a sophisticated equity theft operation. These criminals are getting more organized and more technologically advanced every year. The fact that you avoided signing that contract and the fact that you've gathered this much evidence could be incredibly valuable to law enforcement." Margaret agreed to meet me that afternoon to review all the documents and help me understand exactly what legal violations Derek and his associates might have committed. But she also gave me some sobering news about the challenges we'd face in pursuing this case. "The problem with these operations," she explained, "is that they're often structured to stay just barely on the legal side of fraud. They use real business entities, legitimate-looking contracts, and carefully worded language that gives them plausible deniability if anyone challenges their practices." After hanging up with Margaret, I realized I needed to document everything while the details were still fresh in my mind. I pulled out the old stenographer's notebook I'd used for taking minutes at school board meetings and began writing down every conversation I had had with Derek, every promise he'd made, every inconsistency I could remember. The process took nearly 2 hours, but by the time I finished, I had a detailed timeline of Derek's manipulation tactics that could help other potential victims recognize the warning signs. My next step was to research Derek Thornfield and Prestige Holdings online. George had always been skeptical of the internet, preferring newspapers and phone calls to computer research, but our grandson Tyler had taught me how to use search engines during one of his visits last summer. What I found when I started digging into Derek's background was both illuminating and disturbing. Prestige Holdings appeared to be a legitimate business entity registered with the state, complete with an official website featuring professional photographs of smiling seniors and testimonials from supposedly satisfied clients who'd supposedly benefited from their equity release programs. But when I looked more closely at the details, inconsistencies began to emerge. The business address listed on their website was actually a mailbox service in a strip mall 40 miles away. The phone number went to an answering service that claimed to represent multiple companies. The testimonials all used stock photography. I recognized one of the satisfied clients from a toothpaste advertisement I had seen in a magazine. Even more concerning was what I found when I searched for Derek Thornfield's name. There were no professional profiles, no business associations, no community involvement records. Nothing that would indicate he was an established member of the financial services industry.
It was as if Derek Thornfield had materialized out of thin air 3 months ago for the sole purpose of stealing houses from vulnerable seniors. But the real breakthrough came when I decided to search for news articles about equity theft scams in our region. What I discovered made my stomach turn. Over the past 18 months, there had been at least 6 reported cases of seniors losing their homes to similar schemes in counties surrounding ours. The details varied slightly, but the pattern was unmistakable. Predators targeting recently widowed homeowners, offering equity release programs that turned out to be sophisticated theft operations, and disappearing with valuable properties while leaving their victims homeless and penniless. One article from the Regional Herald described the case of Robert and Linda Martinez, an elderly couple who lost their home of 40 years to a company called Golden Years Financial Solutions after the husband developed dementia and the wife signed papers she didn't understand while dealing with his medical crisis. Another article detailed how Helen Henderson, a 78-year-old widow, had been evicted from her family home just 3 months after signing an equity assistance agreement with a company called Senior Housing Partners.
The names Lily had overheard Derek mentioning, the Henderson property and the Martinez situation, weren't just random references. They were likely previous victims of the same criminal network, people whose homes had already been stolen by the time Derek set his sights on mine. The realization that I was looking at evidence of serial predation, of an organized operation that had been systematically destroying families across multiple counties, filled me with a cold rage that I'd never experienced before. I printed out every article, every business registration record, every piece of evidence I could find, and added it to the growing file of documentation. By the time Lily came downstairs for breakfast, I had assembled what looked like a prosecutor's case file against Derek Thornfield and his criminal associates. "Grandma Rosalind?" Lily said, rubbing her sleepy eyes and looking at the paper spread across our dining room table. "Did you stay up all night catching the bad guys?" Her innocent question made me smile for the first time since this ordeal began. "Not quite, sweetheart," I replied, "but I'm getting started. And you know what? I think we're going to need your help to make sure these bad guys can't hurt any more families." Lily's face lit up with the kind of excitement that only children get when they're invited to participate in important adult business. What I didn't tell her yet was that my research had revealed something else. Something that suggested Derek's operation was much larger and more dangerous than I'd initially realized. Hidden in the business registration records, I'd found connections between Prestige Holdings and at least 4 other companies that appeared to be running similar schemes across a 5-state region. We weren't just dealing with a local con man anymore. We were dealing with what appeared to be a multi-state criminal enterprise that had stolen millions of dollars worth of property from vulnerable seniors. But instead of feeling overwhelmed by the scope of what we were up against, I felt energized by the possibility that stopping Derek might also stop dozens of other predators who were preying on people like me. Margaret was right. Gathering this evidence could be incredibly valuable to law enforcement, and if my near disaster could prevent even one other family from losing their home to these criminals, then everything Derek had put me through would have been worth it. The hunter was about to become the hunted, and Derek Thornfield had no idea what was coming for him. That afternoon, Margaret arrived at my house carrying a leather briefcase that looked remarkably similar to Derek's, though hers contained actual legal expertise rather than predatory contracts. She spent nearly an hour reviewing every document I'd assembled, occasionally making notes in her precise handwriting or asking pointed questions about specific details of my interactions with Derek. When she finally looked up from the pile of evidence, her expression was grim but determined. "Rosalind, what you've uncovered here is substantial enough to warrant immediate action," she said, adjusting her reading glasses. "But we need to be strategic about how we approach this. If Derek and his associates realize they're being investigated, they could disappear overnight and resurface in another state with new identities and business names. We need to gather more evidence while making it appear that you are still a potential victim."
The plan Margaret proposed was both brilliant and terrifying. She suggested that I contact Derek directly, claiming that I had second thoughts about refusing to sign his contract. I would tell him that after discussing the situation with my family, I'd realized his offer was actually quite generous, and I'd like to schedule another meeting to review the paperwork. This would accomplish two goals. It would bring Derek back into the open, where we could observe his tactics more carefully, and it would buy us time to set up proper documentation of his criminal behavior. You mean I have to pretend I want to sign away my house? I asked, feeling my stomach clench at the thought of inviting that predator back into my home. Not exactly, Margaret replied with a slight smile. You're going to pretend you're reconsidering his offer while we record every word he says and document every lie he tells. By the time we're finished with Mr. Thornfield, we'll have enough evidence to not only prosecute him, but to shut down his entire operation. Margaret explained that what Derek was doing likely constituted multiple felonies: fraud, elder abuse, conspiracy, and possibly racketeering if we could prove the multi-state connections I'd discovered. But getting law enforcement to take the case seriously would require irrefutable evidence of criminal intent, not just questionable business practices. We needed Derek to incriminate himself, and the only way to do that was to give him another opportunity to commit his crimes while we were watching him. The next morning, I made the phone call that felt like jumping off a cliff without knowing if there was water below. Derek answered on the second ring, his voice carrying that same smooth confidence that had almost convinced me to trust him just days earlier. Mrs. Whitmore, what a pleasant surprise. I do hope you're doing well after our unfortunate misunderstanding the other day. His tone suggested that Lily's intervention had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience, easily overcome with the right approach.
Actually, Derek, that's why I'm calling, I said, forcing my voice to sound uncertain and apologetic. I've been thinking about what you said, about the financial opportunities I might be missing by not taking advantage of your program. My daughter seems to think I was too hasty in refusing your offer. The change in Derek's demeanor was immediate and obvious. I could practically hear him sitting up straighter, his predatory instincts activated by the scent of a potential victim returning to the trap. Well, Mrs. Whitmore, I'm certainly glad to hear that you're reconsidering. Financial decisions of this magnitude should never be made in haste, and family input is always valuable in these situations. We scheduled another meeting for the following Tuesday afternoon, ostensibly to review the contract terms and address any concerns I might have developed since our last encounter. Derek was more than happy to accommodate my request for a more detailed explanation of the program, promising to bring additional documentation that would help me understand exactly how beneficial the arrangement would be for someone in my situation. After hanging up, I felt like I'd just agreed to wrestle with a snake, but Margaret assured me that we'd taken the first crucial step in what she predicted would be Derek's downfall. Predators like him can't resist the opportunity to close a deal they thought they'd lost, she explained. His ego won't let him walk away from a victim who's come back asking for more information. He'll be so focused on getting your signature that he'll reveal more about his operation than he ever intended. The next few days were spent in intensive preparation. Margaret arranged for a colleague of hers, a private investigator named Thomas Chen, to install hidden recording equipment in my dining room. Thomas was a retired police detective who specialized in financial crimes, and he assured me that everything we were doing was completely legal, since Derek would be attempting to commit fraud in my own home. The beauty of this setup, Thomas explained, as he positioned a tiny camera inside my china cabinet, is that we're not entrapping him. We're simply giving him the opportunity to do what he was already planning to do, while making sure there's a permanent record of exactly how he operates. Meanwhile, I worked with Margaret to prepare a list of questions designed to get Derek to reveal as much as possible about his business practices, his associates, and his other victims. The goal was to appear genuinely interested in his program while subtly steering the conversation toward topics that would expose the criminal nature of his operation.
But the most important preparation involved Lily. We needed her to be present during Derek's visit, both to maintain the appearance of a normal family situation and because her sharp ears had already proven invaluable in detecting Derek's lies. Margaret suggested that we tell Lily she would be our special helper, responsible for listening carefully and remembering anything important that Derek said. "Can I be like a secret agent?" Lily asked excitedly when we explained her role in our plan. "Can I have a code name and everything?" "You can be Agent Lily," I told her, "and your mission is to protect our family by helping us catch the bad guys who try to steal houses from grandmas and grandpas." Lily took her assignment with the seriousness that only children can bring to games that adults know are deadly serious. She practiced sitting quietly and listening. She rehearsed asking innocent questions that might get Derek to reveal more information, and she even created a secret signal, touching her nose, that she would use if she heard Derek say something particularly important. As Tuesday afternoon approached, I found myself oscillating between nervous excitement and genuine terror. On one hand, I was proud of what we were attempting and hopeful that our efforts might save other families from Derek's predatory schemes. On the other hand, I was about to invite a dangerous criminal back into my home and pretend that I was willing to hand him everything George and I had worked for over nearly 4 decades. But every time doubt crept into my mind, I thought about the Martinez family and Helen Henderson and all the other seniors whose homes had already been stolen by Derek and his associates. I thought about the sophisticated data mining operation that was identifying vulnerable widows and widowers across multiple states. I thought about how many other families might lose their homes if we didn't find a way to stop this criminal enterprise. Margaret arrived an hour before Derek was scheduled to appear, ostensibly for a friendly visit, but actually to make final preparations for what we hoped would be the beginning of the end for Prestige Holdings. Thomas had positioned himself in an unmarked van across the street, ready to monitor our hidden recording equipment and call for backup if anything went wrong. "Remember," Margaret said as we watched Derek's black sedan pull into my driveway exactly on time, "you're not actually going to sign anything, no matter how convincing he sounds or how much pressure he applies. We're gathering evidence, not completing a transaction."
As Derek walked up my front path, carrying his leather briefcase and wearing that same charming smile that had almost convinced me to trust him, I took a deep breath and prepared to turn the tables on a predator who had no idea he was walking into a trap set by a 73-year-old grandmother and her 7-year-old co-conspirator. The hunter was about to become the hunted, and this time, we were ready for him. Derek walked into my dining room that Tuesday afternoon, carrying himself with the confident swagger of a man who believed he was about to close the deal of a lifetime. He'd dressed even more expensively than usual. A navy blue suit that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, Italian leather shoes that clicked authoritatively against my hardwood floors, and a gold watch that caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through my lace curtains. Everything about his appearance was designed to project success and trustworthiness, the image of a financial professional who had helped countless clients secure their futures. "Mrs. Whitmore, I cannot tell you how pleased I am that you decided to reconsider our discussion," he said, settling into the same chair where he'd sat during our previous meetings. "Family input is so valuable in these situations, and I'm delighted that your loved ones helped you see the wisdom of exploring all your options." What Derek didn't know was that Margaret was positioned in my kitchen, quietly monitoring the hidden recording equipment while pretending to help me prepare refreshments. Lily was upstairs in her room, officially playing with her dolls, but actually listening to every word through the heating vent that connected directly to the dining room. And Thomas was parked across the street in his surveillance van, recording everything through the sophisticated equipment he'd installed throughout my house. I have to admit, Derek, I was probably too emotional during our last conversation, I said, forcing myself to sound apologetic and slightly embarrassed. Losing George has been so difficult, and sometimes I don't think as clearly as I should about financial matters. My daughter, Janet, helped me understand that I was being foolish to refuse such a generous offer. Derek's eyes lit up with predatory satisfaction, and I could see him mentally calculating his commission on what he believed would be an easy conquest. Please don't apologize, Mrs. Whitmore. Grief affects everyone differently, and it's completely natural to feel overwhelmed when making important financial decisions. That's exactly why Prestige Holdings exists, to help people like you navigate these challenging transitions with professional guidance and support. He spread the same contract across my dining room table, along with several new documents he claimed would address any concerns I might have developed. I've brought some additional paperwork that I think will help clarify exactly how our program works, he said, his voice taking on the practiced rhythm of a well-rehearsed sales presentation. What we're offering you is really quite remarkable, the opportunity to access your home's equity while maintaining your right to live here for the rest of your life. This was where our plan began to unfold. Following Margaret's coaching, I started asking questions designed to get Derek to reveal the true nature of his operation. I'm curious about something, Derek. How many other families in our area have taken advantage of this program? Are there other people in Willowbrook who've had similar experiences? Derek's smile never wavered, but I caught a slight hesitation before he answered. Oh, we've helped dozens of families throughout this region, Mrs. Whitmore. Just last month, we assisted a lovely couple named the Martinez family, wonderful people who were struggling with medical debt, much like you've been experiencing. They were so grateful for our help in accessing their home's equity. My heart started racing as I realized Derek had just confirmed what Lily had overheard him discussing on the phone. He was openly admitting to involvement in the Martinez case, the same case I'd found documented in newspaper articles as a sophisticated home theft scheme. But I forced myself to maintain my role as an interested potential victim. That's wonderful to hear, I said. And they were able to stay in their home after signing with your company? It was a crucial question designed to get Derek to either lie outright or reveal the true terms of his contracts. Well, every situation is unique, Derek replied, his tone becoming slightly more evasive. The Martinez family ultimately decided that relocating to a senior living community better suited their changing needs. But the important thing is that our program gave them the financial flexibility to make that choice on their own terms. Margaret had warned me that this was exactly the kind of misleading language Derek would use, technically true statements that concealed the reality of what had happened to his victims. The Martinez family hadn't chosen to relocate. They'd been evicted after Derek's company invoked the vague property standards clauses that I had avoided signing just days earlier. I see, I said, pretending to find his explanation reassuring. And what about ongoing oversight? Once I sign these documents, how does Prestige Holdings ensure that everything continues to go smoothly?
This question clearly made Derek uncomfortable, though he tried to hide it behind his practiced smile. We have a very professional property management team that conducts periodic assessments to ensure that our clients are maintaining their homes according to reasonable standards. It's really just a formality. We want to protect our investment while ensuring that you're living in a safe, well-maintained environment. There it was, the admission that Prestige Holdings considered my home their investment, not mine. Derek had just revealed on hidden camera that his company viewed the properties they targeted as assets they controlled, despite claiming that homeowners retained ownership rights. But Derek wasn't finished incriminating himself. As he warmed to his subject, apparently convinced that he was successfully manipulating another vulnerable widow, he began revealing details about his operation that would have terrified me if I hadn't been prepared for them. Between you and me, Mrs. Whitmore, he said, leaning forward conspiratorially, we're expanding our operations significantly over the next year. We've identified hundreds of potential clients throughout this region, people just like you who could benefit from our services. The senior housing market is really booming right now, and there's tremendous opportunity for everyone involved. I felt sick as I realized Derek was describing a massive expansion of his predatory operation, targeting hundreds more vulnerable seniors across multiple counties. but I managed to keep my voice steady as I asked, "How do you identify people who might be interested in your program?" Derek's answer was even more damning than I had expected. "We have access to some very sophisticated databases that help us understand demographic trends and identify homeowners who might be facing financial challenges. Public records, insurance claims, medical billing databases. There's really quite a lot of information available if you know where to look for it." He'd just admitted on camera to using illegally obtained personal information to target vulnerable seniors, exactly what my email investigation had suggested. But Derek wasn't done revealing the scope of his criminal enterprise. "In fact," he continued, clearly feeling confident enough to boast about his success, "we're working with partners in several other states to replicate our model in new markets. Arizona, Florida, Texas, anywhere there are large populations of seniors who own valuable properties but might be struggling with fixed incomes or medical expenses." Margaret had been right. We weren't just dealing with a local con man. Derek had just described what sounded like a multi-state racketeering operation using sophisticated data mining to identify victims and coordinating with criminal associates across multiple jurisdictions. As Derek continued his sales presentation, becoming increasingly careless about what he revealed, I realized that our plan was succeeding beyond our wildest expectations. He was so confident in his ability to manipulate me that he was essentially confessing to federal crimes while being recorded in high definition. But the most chilling moment came when Derek started discussing what would happen after I signed his contract. "The beautiful thing about our program, Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "is that it takes all the stress of property management off your shoulders. You won't have to worry about maintenance, repairs, property taxes, insurance. We handle all of that for you. And if you ever decide that this house is becoming too much for you to manage, we can help facilitate a smooth transition to more appropriate accommodations." The euphemistic language couldn't disguise what Derek was really describing: a systematic process for separating elderly homeowners from their properties while making it appear voluntary and beneficial. He was outlining exactly how he'd stolen the homes of the Martinez family, Helen Henderson, and countless other victims. As Derek began laying out the specific documents he wanted me to sign, I caught a glimpse of Lily peering around the corner from the hallway. She gave me our secret signal, touching her nose, indicating that she'd heard something important. Later, I would learn that she had been listening to Derek make phone calls during breaks in our conversation, calls where he'd described me as completely convinced and ready to sign everything. But Derek Thornfield had made a fatal miscalculation. He'd assumed that a grieving widow would be so grateful for his attention and solutions that she wouldn't question his motives or investigate his claims. He'd never imagined that his carefully chosen victim was actually documenting his every move and recording his every admission. The trap was closing around Derek, and he had no idea that his own words were providing the evidence that would destroy him. As Derek finished his presentation and reached for his expensive pen, confident that he was about to complete the theft of my family home, I looked him directly in the eyes and said the words that would change everything between us forever. "Derek, I'm not going to sign these documents today." The transformation in his expression was immediate and startling. The warm, grandfatherly smile vanished, replaced by a cold hardness that revealed the predator underneath his polished exterior. For just a moment, his mask slipped completely, and I saw exactly what kind of man I'd been dealing with all along.
"Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his voice taking on a sharp edge that he'd never allowed me to hear before, "I think you're making a very serious mistake. This offer won't be available indefinitely, and your financial situation isn't going to improve on its own. You need to think about your future, about what happens when you can no longer maintain this property or afford the taxes and upkeep." But I wasn't the same frightened, confused widow who'd almost fallen for his scheme just a week earlier. I'd spent days researching his operation, documenting his lies, and preparing for this moment.
Most importantly, I'd discovered that Derek Thornfield had made the critical error of underestimating both my intelligence and my determination to protect my family. Actually, Derek, I've been doing quite a lot of thinking about my future, I replied, my voice steady and calm. And I've realized that my financial situation is much more stable than you led me to believe. In fact, I've been wondering why someone like you would be so interested in helping someone like me, especially when your help seems to come with such unusual terms. Derek's jaw tightened, and I could see him mentally recalculating his approach. He was clearly accustomed to dealing with confused, desperate seniors who could be bullied or manipulated when his initial charm offensive failed. But he'd never encountered a victim who'd done her homework and was prepared to confront him with facts. "I'm not sure what you mean by unusual terms," he said, attempting to regain his professional composure. "Everything we've discussed is completely standard for equity release programs. Perhaps you've been getting advice from people who don't understand the complexities of senior financial planning." This was my cue to reveal just how much I actually understood about his operation. "Derek, I've had some time to research Prestige Holdings since our last meeting. I've looked into your business registration, your corporate address, and your track record with other clients. I've also been in touch with some families who've had previous dealings with your company." The color drained from Derek's face as he realized that his carefully constructed facade was crumbling. "I don't know what kind of misinformation you've been given, Mrs. Whitmore, but I can assure you that—" "Let me stop you right there," I interrupted, feeling a surge of confidence that I hadn't experienced in months. "Derek, I know about the Martinez family. Derek, I know about Helen Henderson. I know about the dozens of other seniors who've lost their homes to your company's equity release programs. And I know that what you're offering me isn't help. It's theft disguised as assistance." Derek stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against my hardwood floor with a harsh sound that seemed to echo through the suddenly tense room. "Mrs. Whitmore, I think there's been a serious misunderstanding here. If you're not interested in our services, then perhaps it's best if I collect my materials and leave you to handle your financial difficulties on your own." But I wasn't finished with Derek Thornfield yet. Margaret had coached me on exactly how to handle this moment, and I was determined to extract every possible admission from him before he tried to escape. "Actually, Derek, I'd like to clarify a few things about your business practices. For instance, I'm curious about how you obtained my personal information. How did you know about George's death, about our medical bills, about my property tax situation? That's not information that's readily available to the general public." Derek's response was telling in what it didn't say. Instead of providing a direct answer, he deflected. "Mrs. Whitmore, I think you're becoming unnecessarily paranoid about routine business practices. Senior housing specialists like myself use a variety of legitimate research methods to identify people who might benefit from our services." "Legitimate research methods," I repeated slowly. "Is that what you call accessing medical billing databases and insurance records without authorization? Is that what you call building profiles of vulnerable widows and widowers for the purpose of targeting them with predatory schemes?" Derek's jaw tightened and finally cracked completely. "I don't have to listen to these accusations," he snapped, gathering up his papers with jerky, angry movements. "You've clearly been talking to people who don't understand legitimate business practices, and I won't be insulted in this manner." This was the moment I'd been building toward, the point where I could establish my new boundaries and make it clear that Derek Thornfield would never again have the opportunity to manipulate or threaten me. "Derek," I said, standing up to face him across my dining room table, "let me be very clear about something. I know exactly what kind of business you're running, and I know exactly what you tried to do to my family. But here's what you don't know. Everything you've said in this house today has been recorded. Every admission you've made, every threat you've implied, every lie you've told has been documented by people who understand precisely what legal violations you've committed." The look of shock and panic that crossed Derek's face was worth every moment of fear and uncertainty I'd endured over the past week. For the first time since he'd appeared at my door, Derek Thornfield looked like what he actually was, a criminal who'd been caught in the act. "You can't record conversations without consent," he stammered, clearly grasping for any legal protection he could find. "That's illegal in this state." "Actually, Derek, it's not," I replied with a smile that felt genuinely satisfying for the first time in months. "This is my home, and I have every right to record what happens here. But more importantly, you've just admitted to criminal activities on tape, and those recordings are already in the hands of people who know exactly what to do with them." Derek tried one last desperate manipulation, appealing to the confused, frightened widow he'd thought I was. "Mrs. Whitmore, please, I think you've misunderstood my intentions. I'm just trying to help seniors like yourself navigate difficult financial situations. If there's been any confusion about our programs, I'm sure we can work it out." But I was done being manipulated, done being treated like a helpless victim, done allowing predators like Derek to threaten my family's security. "Derek, the only thing I want from you now is for you to leave my house and never contact me again. And I want you to understand that if you or anyone associated with your operation ever approaches me or my family again, those recordings will be turned over to law enforcement immediately." Derek gathered his remaining materials and headed for my front door, his expensive suit and confident demeanor completely undermined by the knowledge that his criminal operation had been exposed. But as he reached for the door handle, I had one final message for him. "Oh, and Derek, you might want to warn your associates that there's a 73-year-old grandmother in Willowbrook who's not as helpless as she appears. Because I'm just getting started on making sure that what you tried to do to my family never happens to anyone else's." As Derek's black sedan disappeared down my street, I realized that I wasn't just protecting my own home anymore. I was declaring war on an entire network of predators who made their living by destroying the lives of vulnerable seniors. The frightened widow was gone. In her place stood a woman who understood her own power and wasn't afraid to use it. 3 days after Derek's ignominious departure from my home, I found myself sitting in the offices of Detective Amanda Richardson at the Regional Financial Crimes Division, surrounded by federal agents, state prosecutors, and enough evidence to fill several filing cabinets. The transformation from isolated widow to key witness in a federal investigation had happened so quickly that I sometimes felt like I was watching someone else's life unfold rather than living my own. Detective Richardson, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who specialized in elder fraud cases, had called me within hours of receiving the recordings and documentation that Thomas had delivered to her office. "Mrs. Whitmore, what you've handed us is the breakthrough we've been waiting for in a case that's been frustrating law enforcement across multiple states for over 2 years." Now, as I sat across from her conference table, watching federal agents analyze Derek's recorded admissions, I was learning the true scope of what Lily and I had helped uncover. The investigation that followed our evidence had revealed a criminal enterprise that stretched from North Carolina to Texas, involving dozens of shell companies, hundreds of forged documents, and estimated damages exceeding $20 million. Derek Thornfield isn't even his real name, Detective Richardson explained, pointing to a photograph on her computer screen. His actual name is Derek Thompson, and he has a criminal history dating back 15 years. Identity theft, mortgage fraud, elder abuse, he has been perfecting these techniques for most of his adult life. Agent Patricia Williams from the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division leaned forward to show me a complex organizational chart that looked like something from a TV crime drama. What Mr. Thompson was running here was essentially a franchise operation for home theft. He'd identify vulnerable seniors using illegally obtained databases, then use a network of fake companies to execute sophisticated equity theft schemes. Your case was just one of hundreds they were planning to complete over the next 2 years. The numbers were staggering. The Martinez family, whose situation Lily had overheard Derek discussing, had lost a home valued at $350,000.
Helen Henderson had lost her property valued at $420,000. Across 5 states, Derek's network had stolen properties worth millions of dollars from seniors who trusted the wrong person at their most vulnerable moments. But what made this case particularly significant, according to the investigators, was that my evidence had provided them with something they'd never been able to obtain before: recorded admissions of criminal intent from someone high enough in the organization to expose the entire network.
Derek thought he was talking to another confused victim, Agent Williams explained. He revealed details about their data mining operations, their coordination with criminal associates in other states, and their systematic targeting of recently widowed homeowners. Those admissions are going to allow us to prosecute not just Derek, but the entire leadership structure of this organization. The confrontation I'd been dreading came when Detective Richardson informed me that Derek had been arrested that morning at a hotel in Charlotte, where he'd apparently been meeting with associates to plan their expansion into Virginia and Tennessee. The news should have made me feel victorious, but instead I felt a complex mixture of relief, satisfaction, and lingering anger at how close he'd come to destroying my family. "Mrs. Whitmore," Detective Richardson said gently, "I need you to understand that Derek is not going quietly. His lawyers are claiming that he was running a legitimate business, that any misunderstandings were the result of clients not properly reading their contracts. They're trying to portray you as a confused elderly woman who misinterpreted routine business practices." The insult of Derek's legal strategy, attempting to use my age and widowed status as a defense for his crimes, ignited a fire in my chest that surprised me with its intensity. After everything I'd been through, after all the evidence I'd gathered and risks I'd taken to expose his operation, Derek was still trying to dismiss me as just another helpless old woman who couldn't understand what was happening to her. "Let me be very clear about something," I said, my voice carrying a steel that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. Derek Thornfield, or Thompson, or whatever he wants to call himself, made a critical mistake when he targeted my family. He assumed that a 73-year-old widow would be easy prey, someone who would quietly disappear after he stole her home. But what he got instead was a grandmother who spent decades protecting the people she loves, and who wasn't about to stop now. Agent Williams smiled at my response. "Mrs. Whitmore, Derek's lawyers can try whatever strategy they want, but we have him on tape admitting to multiple felonies. We have evidence of his involvement in dozens of similar schemes, and we have a witness who documented his crimes with the thoroughness of a professional investigator. Their defense strategy isn't going to work." But the most satisfying moment of that day came when Detective Richardson showed me the results of the broader investigation that my evidence had triggered. Using the information Derek had revealed during his recorded visits, law enforcement had been able to identify and arrest 12 other members of his criminal network across 5 states. The fake companies had been shut down, their assets frozen, and their victim databases seized. More importantly, Detective Richardson continued, we've been able to contact 43 families who are in various stages of being victimized by Derek's network. Because you came forward when you did, we were able to prevent those families from losing their homes. 43 families. 43 sets of grandparents and widows and elderly couples who'd get to keep their homes because a 7-year-old girl had been brave enough to scream, "Don't sign that paper!" and a grandmother had been stubborn enough to fight back. The legal proceedings that followed stretched over several months, but the outcome was never really in doubt. Derek pled guilty to federal charges of elder fraud, identity theft, and racketeering in exchange for a reduced sentence of 12 years in federal prison. His associates received sentences ranging from 5 to 10 years, depending on their level of involvement in the scheme. But perhaps the most meaningful resolution came from an unexpected source. As part of the criminal asset forfeiture proceedings, law enforcement was able to recover over $8 million in stolen assets from Derek's network. Under federal law, those funds were used to create a victim compensation program that provided restitution to the families who'd lost their homes to Derek's schemes. Helen Henderson got her house back. The Martinez family received enough compensation to purchase a new home in a community where they felt safe and supported.
Dozens of other families received settlements that helped them rebuild their lives after Derek's predatory schemes had destroyed their financial security. Standing in that same dining room where Derek had tried to steal my home, looking at the thank you letters that had arrived from families across 5 states, I realized that my near disaster had been transformed into something far more meaningful than I'd ever imagined possible. Lily, now 8 years old and proud of her role as the secret agent who'd helped catch the bad guys, had started a project at school about protecting elderly people from scams. Her teacher had been so impressed that she'd invited me to speak to the class about recognizing and reporting elder fraud. "Grandma Rosalind," Lily had said after my presentation to her 3rd grade class, "do you think there are other bad people out there trying to steal houses from grandmas and grandpas?"
Probably, sweetheart, I'd replied. But now there are also people like us who know how to stop them. The scared, confused widow who'd almost signed away her family's legacy was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who understood that sometimes the greatest victories come not from avoiding disaster, but from transforming it into something that protects others from experiencing the same threat. Derek Thornfield had tried to steal my home. Instead, he'd given me a purpose that was more valuable than any property: the knowledge that even the most vulnerable among us can fight back and win. 2 years have passed since that October afternoon when Lily burst through my front door and changed the trajectory of both our lives forever. As I sit here in my home office, the same room where George used to pay our bills and where I once felt so overwhelmed by financial decisions, I'm surrounded by evidence of how completely my world has transformed since Derek Thornfield tried to steal our family home. The spare bedroom that used to collect dust and old photo albums has been converted into the headquarters of what people now call the Whitmore Initiative, a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting seniors from financial predators. The walls are covered with maps showing fraud patterns across multiple states, testimonials from families we've helped protect, and photographs from the dozens of community education seminars I've presented over the past 18 months. What started as one grandmother's desperate attempt to save her home has evolved into a comprehensive elder protection program that's been replicated in communities across the Southeast. We've helped law enforcement identify and prosecute 17 separate fraud operations, prevented over 300 families from losing their homes to predatory schemes, and trained thousands of seniors to recognize the warning signs of financial exploitation. The irony isn't lost on me that Derek's attempt to isolate and victimize me actually connected me to a vast network of people who share my determination to protect vulnerable seniors. Margaret Henley became our organization's volunteer legal counsel, using her decades of experience to help other families navigate the complex legal challenges that arise when elderly people become targets of sophisticated fraud operations. Thomas Chen left his private investigation practice to work full-time as our director of fraud prevention, training law enforcement agencies across multiple states to recognize and investigate elder financial abuse. But perhaps the most meaningful transformation has been in my relationship with my own family. Janet and Kevin, who had been so busy with their own lives that they'd missed the signs of my vulnerability after George's death, now serve on our board of directors and have become passionate advocates for senior protection. My son Michael uses his music teaching skills to create educational songs that help elderly people remember fraud prevention tips. Even David, despite living across the country, has used his business connections to help us secure funding for our programs. The distance that had grown between us during my grief and isolation has been replaced by a shared sense of purpose that's brought our family closer than we'd been in years. They've seen me not as the confused widow who'd needed their protection, but as the determined woman who'd fought back against criminals and won. Lily, now 9 years old and in 4th grade, has become something of a local celebrity for her role in exposing Derek's operation. She speaks regularly at school assemblies about trusting your instincts and protecting the elderly people in your life. Her teacher recently told me that Lily's presentation about recognizing scams has been requested by schools in 3 neighboring counties. "Grandma Rosalind," she said to me just last week, "I think what we did was like throwing a rock into a pond. The ripples just keep getting bigger and bigger, helping more and more people." Her childish metaphor captured something profound about how individual acts of courage can create waves of positive change that extend far beyond their original impact.
The financial struggles that had made me vulnerable to Derek's manipulation have long since been resolved not through any dramatic windfall, but through the practical support that comes from being part of a community that genuinely cares about its members. The Whitmore Initiative operates from grants and donations, but it's also generated consulting opportunities that have provided me with meaningful income while allowing me to use my experience to help others. More importantly, I've discovered that the skills I developed during my decades as a mother, school secretary, and community volunteer, the ability to organize complex information, communicate clearly with diverse groups of people, and persist in the face of bureaucratic obstacles, translate perfectly to the work of fighting financial predators and protecting vulnerable populations. Last month, I received a letter from Helen Henderson, the elderly woman whose home had been stolen by Derek's network before I encountered him. The Victim Compensation Fund had enabled her to purchase a small cottage in a senior community where she feels safe and supported. But more than that, she'd become a volunteer with a local organization that helps newly widowed women navigate the financial and legal challenges of living alone.
Mrs. Whitmore, she wrote, I used to think that losing my home was the worst thing that ever happened to me. But now I realize that it led me to work that gives my life meaning and helps other women avoid the same tragedy. Sometimes our greatest disasters become our most important opportunities. Her words resonated with me because they captured exactly what I had experienced over the past 2 years. Derek's attempt to destroy my life had instead revealed strengths I didn't know I possessed and connected me to a purpose that felt more meaningful than anything I'd accomplished during my previous 7 decades. The woman who had once felt invisible and forgotten in her grief has become someone whose expertise is sought by law enforcement agencies, whose testimony has influenced state legislation, and whose story has inspired other seniors to recognize their own power to fight back against those who would exploit them. But the most profound change has been internal. The fear and confusion that dominated my life after George's death have been replaced by confidence and clarity about my own capabilities. I no longer see myself as a victim of circumstances beyond my control, but as someone who has the knowledge, experience, and determination to protect not only myself, but countless others who might be targeted by predators like Derek. When people ask me if I ever regret the day Derek Thornfield knocked on my door, I tell them that I regret his attempt to steal my home, but I don't regret the journey it started. Because that journey led me to discover that even the most vulnerable among us possess the power to fight back and win, that individual courage can create community-wide protection, and that sometimes our greatest challenges become our most important opportunities to serve others. Lily was right about the ripples spreading outward from the rock we threw into the pond, but what she didn't mention is that those ripples eventually come back to strengthen the shore from which they originated. The home that Derek tried to steal has become the headquarters of an organization that protects thousands of other homes. The family that almost fell apart in the face of one man's greed has been reunited by a shared commitment to preventing other families from facing the same threat. I'm 75 years old now, and I've learned that it's never too late to discover who you really are when you're fighting for something that matters more than your own comfort or safety. Derek Thornfield thought he was targeting a helpless widow, but what he actually did was awaken a protector whose greatest victories were still ahead of her. The scared, isolated woman who almost signed away her family's legacy is gone forever. In her place stands someone who understands that true security comes not from avoiding all risks, but from having the courage to stand up to those who would exploit our vulnerabilities, and the wisdom to transform our own survival into protection for others. Sometimes the best defense really is a good offense, and sometimes the people who tried to destroy us end up giving us exactly what we need to become who we were always meant to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.